$5.7 billion. That is how much money the United States tourism industry lost in 2025 because Canadians decided to stay home. Not because of a recession, not because of exchange rates, because Donald Trump spent a year treating Canada like a subordinate territory that should be grateful for American attention, and Canadians responded by taking their vacation dollars elsewhere. Ski resorts in Montana watching their Canadian bookings collapse, hotels in Florida seeing 20% drops in visitors, restaurants in Maine reporting their worst year ever, worse than COVID, duty-free shops at the border cutting staff by 80%, all because the President of the United States kept saying he wanted to annex Canada as the 51st state, and Canadians took it personally. This was not organized by the Canadian government. This was not mandated by law. This was 20 million people individually deciding that if Trump views them with contempt, they will spend their money somewhere that actually wants them. And the economic damage is so severe that American senators are traveling to Ottawa begging for the boycott to end. Congressional committees are publishing reports documenting the devastation. Welcome to the unintended consequences of insulting your largest source of international tourism, where rhetoric has a price tag measured in billions, and Trump's need to dominate allies is costing American workers their jobs. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Tonight, we are showing you the scale of Canada's tourism boycott, which American communities are suffering the most, and why this represents a fundamental shift in how Canadians view their relationship with the United States that will outlast Trump's presidency. Let's start with the scale of economic damage that Trump's rhetoric created. The United States Travel Association forecasted a 3.2% decline in international tourism spending for 2025, $5.7 billion in losses compared to the previous year. And they attribute the decline primarily to one factor: Canadians are not coming anymore. Canadians are the largest group of international tourists to the United States, 28% of all foreign visitors, $20.5 billion in spending in 2024 alone. 20.4 million visitors crossing the border annually to shop, vacation, visit family, and support American businesses. And in 2025, that river of tourism dollars became a trickle. October data from Statistics Canada shows return trips by Canadians to the United States dropped 24% for air travel and 30% for land travel compared to the same month in 2024. Not down a few points, down by a quarter to a third. Road travel from Canada fell 38% in May, air travel down 22% in June, the fifth consecutive month of year-over-year declines, each month worse than the one before as the boycott momentum built. Border crossings between January and October declined nearly 20% overall, with some states seeing drops as large as 27%. This is not random fluctuation, this is systematic avoidance. A Longwoods International study in April found that 60% of Canadians were less likely to travel to the United States in the next year due to American policies, trade practices, and political statements. Of those, 36% had already canceled planned trips. An Angus Reid survey in mid-February found that 48% of Canadians had already canceled or were seriously likely to cancel or delay plans to travel to the United States. In Quebec, of the 20% who had plans to travel to the United States in 2025, 45% either already canceled or intended to cancel. That represents an estimated $3 billion in economic losses for the United States just from one Canadian province. These are not hypothetical numbers. These are actual trips canceled, actual hotel rooms empty, actual restaurant tables unfilled, actual stores without customers. And the American tourism industry is in crisis. A Congressional Joint Economic Committee report published in December documented the devastation state by state with data and testimonials from business owners whose livelihoods depend on Canadian tourism. New Hampshire saw a 30% decrease in Canadian visitors. State-run campground reservations down 71% in the first 5 months of 2025. One hotel owner in North Conway reported 30% of rooms empty during summer weekends that usually sell out. Maine business owners described catastrophic losses. Old Orchard Beach reported a 50% drop in Canadian visitors, the worst year we have had. We have never had a year like that, even worse than COVID, said business owner Moshe Agam. Montana, where Canadians accounted for nearly 80% of international visitors in 2024 and contributed $170 million to the state economy, saw border crossings down 19% in the first 10 months of 2025. One hotel reported a $38,000 loss after a Canadian sports team canceled its reservation for 70 rooms and a 200-person dinner. Diane Medler, executive director of Discover Kalispell in Montana, stated businesses noticed a 25% decrease in Canadian travel in spring and a 44% drop later in the year. Credit card spending in Kalispell plunged 39% in 2025 compared to the previous year. Florida, one of the top destinations for Canadian snowbirds, saw visitor numbers plummet 20% in the second quarter and 17% in the first quarter. Real estate agents reported Canadians putting homes up for sale due to the current environment between Canada and the United States, with Canadians representing 15 to 20% of buyers in some markets. Hawaii experienced a 9.4% decline in Canadian visitors in the first 7 months of 2025 compared to 2024, and a 27% decline compared to pre-pandemic 2019 levels. Spending by Canadian visitors fell 4.9% from $668 million to a lower figure. Restaurants reported noticeable declines, with one stating that Canadian arrivals to Maui were down 28% compared to 2019. Vermont accommodations, New Jersey campgrounds, Niagara Falls hotels all reported similar stories. Bookings down, revenues down, staff cuts. Economic pain spreading through communities that built their business models around reliable Canadian tourism. The congressional report concluded, going back for generations, Canadians have visited many states along the United States-Canada border to see family or friends, stay in our hotels, share a meal at our restaurants, and shop at our stores. However, in the wake of President Trump's reckless tariffs and needless provocations, fewer and fewer Canadians are making trips to the United States, putting many American businesses in jeopardy. The boycott is not about spreadsheets and economic models. It is about individual Canadians making conscious choices to avoid the United States because Trump made them feel unwelcome in a country many considered a second home. Lena Yusufi, a Vancouver attorney, typically visits Hawaii 4 or 5 times a year. She used to live in Maui and was considering buying a 2-bedroom condo there. But after Trump imposed tariffs and repeated his wish to turn Canada into the 51st state, she canceled her trips. Obviously, out of loyalty to Canada and our values and just holding our ground, we had to cancel. A woman from British Columbia forfeited a $5,000 deposit to cancel a 5-week vacation to Palm Springs. Not rescheduled, canceled. Taking a $5,000 loss rather than spend money in the United States, a Florida motel owner reported, "I have seen a customer dropping a $1,000 deposit to choose to go to Cuba instead." Canadians are choosing Cuba, a country under American sanctions, over Florida because they would rather support a Caribbean island than give money to Trump's America. One retiree from Cobourg, Ontario, had traveled to Orlando, Florida to play golf every winter for 20 years. In March, he canceled his annual trip and stated he would not return while Trump was in office. By December, his position had not changed. Still no change. Not going back. Lorna Hunt, CEO of the tour company Great Canadian Holidays, stated that most of the firm's United States tours are dead in the water because Canadian customers backed out. The anger is not with the American people, the anger is with Donald Trump. And the feeling is that if he is going to go to war with Canada, something we never asked for, an economic war, then why on earth would they spend a nickel in the United States when they don't have to? That sentiment is echoed across Canada. An Ipsos poll in early February found that 68% of Canadians thought less of the United States after Trump announced tariffs, not disagreed with policy. Thought less of the country itself? This is not temporary political disagreement. This is fundamental reassessment of whether the United States deserves Canadian money, Canadian tourism, and Canadian goodwill. The boycott is not keeping Canadians home. It is redirecting them to destinations that actually welcome them. A Snowbird Advisor survey found that 70% of Canadian snowbirds plan to visit the United States this winter, down from 82% last year. But 23% plan international destinations other than the United States, up from 12% who did so last winter. The number planning overseas travel nearly doubled. Mexico, Costa Rica, warmer European countries are all benefiting from Canadians looking for winter sunshine without the political baggage of supporting Trump. The Caribbean is seeing increased bookings. Even Cuba is gaining Canadian tourists who used to go to Florida. And many Canadians are simply traveling within Canada. Provincial governments noted increased interest from Canadian tourists and deployed new advertising campaigns encouraging domestic travel. Manitoba increased the budget of Tourism Manitoba by $4.5 million, specifically to capture Canadians who might otherwise have gone to the United States. This internal redirection has economic benefits for Canada, while simultaneously denying revenue to American businesses. Canadians are not sacrificing vacations. They are spending their money at home or in countries that treat them with respect. The shift is so significant that duty-free shops at the border, which depend on Canadians crossing to shop in the United States, reported sales declines of 40 to 50% between January and April. One Surrey-based owner of a duty-free shop stated, "Our business has dropped over 80%, and now we have reduced our staff and reduced our working hours." This morning we are operating on a skeleton staff of only 3 to 4 people, when usually we have about 20 people working. 80% decline. From 20 staff to 3 or 4. That is not a downturn. That is collapse. American tourism boards and businesses, watching billions in revenue disappear, have launched increasingly desperate campaigns to lure Canadians back. Montana, after initially abandoning Canadian tourism campaigns in summer when they received negative reactions, is trying again with a Canadian welcome pass offering discounts on hotels, restaurants, and attractions exclusively for Canadian visitors. "We miss you," the campaign pleads. Las Vegas rolled out week-long sales with special tourism discounts targeting Canadians. Buffalo, Seattle, Upstate, New York all launched campaigns with deals, trying to demonstrate they still value Canadian visitors. Palm Springs put up signs across downtown reading "Palm Springs loves Canada," with the mayor noting Canadians spend $300 million a year in the region. California launched an entire state tourism campaign encouraging Canadians to visit. These are not normal marketing efforts. These are emergency responses to economic crisis. American communities that depend on Canadian tourism are begging them to come back, offering discounts and reassurances that they are still welcome even if the president treats them with contempt. But the campaigns are not working because the issue is not price or convenience. The issue is that Trump spent a year telling Canadians they are not a real country, they should be annexed, they exist only to serve American interests, and you cannot discount your way out of that insult. Senator Maggie Hassan, ranking member of the congressional committee that published the report on Canadian tourism losses, stated, "In the wake of President Trump's reckless tariffs and needless provocations, fewer and fewer Canadians are making trips to the United States." Hassan was part of a 4-senator delegation that traveled to Ottawa in July to meet with Prime Minister Mark Carney and discuss the damage. American senators going to Canada to apologize for their president's behavior and plead for economic relief. But the political damage is done, and the economic consequences are accelerating. The United States Travel Association estimates that even a 10% reduction in Canadian tourism means $2.1 billion in lost spending and 14,000 American jobs at risk. Current data suggests the actual decline is significantly worse than 10%. Tourism economics forecasts that if the trade war expands to include not just Canada but Mexico, China, and Europe, the result could be a $22 billion loss in tourism revenue from international visitors. $22 billion, and much of that would come from Canadian boycott effects rippling through the industry. The broader travel sector is projecting a $70 billion travel trade deficit for 2025. The United States historically enjoyed a travel trade surplus, more international tourists coming in than Americans traveling abroad. Trump's policies have reversed that completely. This matters because tourism is not like manufacturing, where you can just restart production when conditions improve. Tourists who develop new vacation patterns, discover new destinations, build new traditions, do not automatically return when political tensions ease. Canadians who spent 2025 exploring the Caribbean or traveling within Canada or visiting Europe have now established those alternatives, hotels they like, restaurants they discovered, activities they enjoyed. Why go back to Florida when Costa Rica was wonderful and did not come with political baggage? The reputational damage to American tourism will persist long after Trump leaves office. Every Canadian who canceled a trip, forfeited a deposit, changed vacation plans because they felt unwelcome remembers that feeling. And many will not forget, even when the specific provocations end. Young Canadians who might have developed lifelong patterns of visiting the United States for spring break, summer vacations, winter getaways, are instead building travel patterns that exclude America. That is future revenue lost for decades. The tourism boycott sends a message that Trump either cannot or will not acknowledge. Actions have consequences, even for the President of the United States. When you treat allies with contempt, they respond. When you threaten to annex a sovereign nation, its citizens take offense. When you impose punitive tariffs and claim your neighbor is stealing from you, they decide not to give you their money voluntarily. Trump operates on the assumption that American economic and military power means allies have no choice but to accept whatever treatment Washington dishes out. The Canadian tourism boycott proves that assumption wrong. 20 million individual Canadians exercising consumer choice to avoid the United States is economic power that no trade negotiation can override and no tariff can counteract. It is soft power in reverse, where the smaller country punishes the larger one through voluntary actions that cost American workers billions. And unlike government policies that can be negotiated or reversed, consumer sentiment is slow to change and hard to repair. You cannot sign an agreement to make Canadians want to vacation in your country again. You have to rebuild trust over years. Trump's approval rating sits at 36% in the United States. His favorability in Canada is even lower. And every month that Canadians continue avoiding American travel, American businesses suffer economic damage that creates political pressure for policy changes. Republican senators from border states are already breaking with Trump on tariffs because the economic pain is too severe to ignore. Tourism boycott effects amplify that pressure by hitting service industry workers, small business owners, and communities that vote Republican but need Canadian dollars to survive. The most significant aspect of the tourism boycott is not the $5.7 billion in immediate losses. It is what the boycott reveals about how fundamentally the Canada-United States relationship has changed. For generations, Canadians viewed the United States as a close neighbor, a reliable partner, and a natural destination for travel and commerce. That relationship was built on assumptions of mutual respect, shared values, and predictable behavior. Trump destroyed those assumptions, and once trust is gone, it does not come back just because the political leadership changes. Canadians who are now exploring alternatives to American travel, buying Canadian products instead of American brands, building business relationships outside North America, are not doing so because it is convenient. They are doing so because they have learned that relying on American stability is a mistake. The tourism boycott is the most visible manifestation of that shift, but it is part of a broader pattern.
They used to say Britain was a land of rolling hills and freedom's hard won. But today, drones patrol the rural skies. CCTV towers pierce the horizon like silver thorns. And a silent war, fought not with bombs, but with biometric scanners and social scorecards, has begun. In a parliamentary session now echoing across the continent, U.S., Senator J.D. Vance didn't mince his words. What Labor is building isn't a country, it's a digital gulag. Behind him, a reel of damning footage played, facial recognition tests running quietly in Kent villages, police knocking on doors over online speech, farmers forced to scan biometric IDs just to refuel their tractors. This isn't fiction. It's Starmer's Britain. The senator continued. You're criminalizing dissent and rewarding dependency. That's not governance, that's digital feudalism. And he's right. Labor isn't digitizing services. They're digitizing control of land, licenses, livelihoods. The gulf between the government and the governed has never been wider, and the countryside now finds itself under siege by a metropolitan elite wielding code instead of compassion. The average Brit may not have noticed. But those in the soil, farmers, truckers, builders have. And they aren't staying silent anymore. It started with a promise, progress, efficiency, digital convenience. That's how oppressive regimes always sell their first lines of code. One by one, they introduce system after system, until you wake up in a world where you need permission to milk a cow. Starmer's labor didn't begin its war on farmers with soldiers. It started with scanners, logins, and quiet legislation passed when most were asleep. In 2025, the rollout of the UK digital ID seemed harmless enough. A digital passport for accessing government services. What could go wrong? But today, from Devon to Yorkshire, you need it to buy feed, to access subsidies, to transport goods. And if you don't have it, your account is flagged. Your farm isn't authorized. At the same time, the Bank of England's central bank digital currency began quiet infrastructure tests. No one paid much attention until small meat processors in Lincolnshire couldn't get payment tools cleared because their systems weren't digitally verified. They didn't close down because demand was low. They shut because Trust Score Framework flagged them as non-integrated. Then the farming equipment started becoming ID-locked. A tractor isn't just a tractor anymore. It's a biometric access platform now. One respected dairy family in Wales was locked out of £170,000 of equipment after missing a compliance deadline on facial ID. People asked, why? Who benefits? But the answer was predictable. Facial recognition software contracts have been traced back to American giants, Vanguard, BlackRock, and a host of labor-linked advisory NGOs, quietly sitting on boards for the very regulation committees approving these schemes. The digital ID platforms aren't publicly owned. They're privatized, for-profit, and backed by donors who wine and dine in London while regulating the countryside into silence. This is about safety, labor insisted, but safety for whom? Because the producers, the actual workers, weren't protected. They were monitored, watched, complied, tagged. There's another reality. These systems rarely apply to the protected classes, never to the migrant hotels, never to the politicians' procurement buddies, never to global capital. They throw £400 a week into luxury hotels for migrant claimants, but spend £850 per enforcement officer tagging facial scanners to tractors. As one farmhand said, we're scanned like cattle and treated worse than them. Where did this new obsession come from? A leaked Home Office memo in late 2025 gave us horrifying insight. Titled Behavioral Risk Indicators by Region, it suggested that resistance to digital compliance in rural districts may indicate underlying radicalization tendencies, and recommended flagging social posts that include pictures of biometric blockers or flags reading "farmers over firewalls." Read that again. If you refuse to scan your face to access your own 200-acre land, you might be listed on a farmer watch list. One line from the memo still haunts those who read it. The persistent self-reliance culture in rural land workers creates risks to future digital integration strategies. That is not policy. That is ideological warfare. And this is what J.D. Vance meant when he said digital gulag. Because that's exactly what a gulag is, not just bound by fences but by permissions. By checkpoints built of chips, not chains. In Wiltshire, a fourth-generation farmer was raided at 6 a.m. on suspicion of coordinated digital obstruction. His crime? He helped 3 other farmers install manual overrides to bypass the compulsory biometric ignition scanners for their combines. No theft, no violence. Just men trying to do their job. Now he's banned from participating in DEFRA's subsidy platform for 5 years. And yet, as labor pushed harder, the countryside began to push back. It began with refusal. Then came the rebellion. In Durham, a convoy of 13 tractors blockaded the Regional Ministry of Agriculture office. In Kent, face-scanning kiosks installed at 2 supply hubs were torched by members of the so-called Free Hands Front, a grassroots group of farmers and truckers who refused to integrate with the surveillance grid. Across dozens of protests, the chant echoed, "Our land, our hands, not your scanners." These weren't political operatives. These were fathers, mothers, sons, builders, growers, meat cutters, people with dirt beneath their nails and nothing left to surrender. Labor's response? Silence on major media, criminal proceedings in the shadows. Even an absurd government campaign branding these people as far-right agitators masquerading as farmers. But the cameras are rolling now. Independent journalists are documenting what's happening in places like Herefordshire. Elderly farmers locked out of their own seed silos because they refused to complete digital profile onboarding. Starmer's technocrats write it off as operational friction. But what this truly is systemic cleansing of the independent class. Displace the farmers, digitally strangle the hauliers, regulate the small butchers and breeders until they break. And once they're gone, the land doesn't vanish. It just gets bought, quietly, by global consortiums, investment boards in Davos, NGOs with vague missions and black budgets. But here's the good news: the spirit of resistance is growing faster than the state can contain. Where one kiosk burns, 10 others tremble. Where one convoy is stopped, another reroutes. What labor doesn't understand is this: you cannot treat the working class like code, because code doesn't bleed, people do. And the people who build, who grow, who move, they are no longer interested in permission slips from parasites. Because when control becomes this precise, this manic, and this personal, revolution becomes not radical, but rational. When the shelves emptied, London finally looked up. First it was eggs, then pork, then fresh milk. Shops started limiting checkout items. Delivery trucks ran late or didn't arrive at all, and yet no bomb went off. No factory burned down. It was something far simpler and far more terrifying. The producers had stopped producing. Across the countryside, farms that weren't digitally compliant were locked out of supply chains. Without verified license renewals, abattoirs couldn't operate. Smallholders selling to independent grocers were threatened with permanent exclusion from the digital agriculture network, a system now required to sell at market. In Sheffield, a butcher with a 30-year career was fined and shut down for unauthorized payment gateways. Translation: he accepted cash